Hello, good morning. I can hear you, I cannot see you whatsoever. Um, so if you have questions, I don't know what to do about it. So I guess we'll have to take those at the end when they can put up the lights again. So when you have one, try to write it down or remember it. Hello, good morning, I'm Derick. I'm living in London for a long time. I used to be the PHP 7.4 release manager, but PHP 7.4 is no longer supported, and neither is PHP 7 itself. So if you're not in PHP 8 yet, you have some work to do in the next few weeks. I'm employed by the PHP Foundation to work on the language itself, and that's kind of interesting. If you have any suggestions for the language, come and find me later. I'll be around for the next few days. I've also developed the debugging extension Xdebug that you might be aware of. If not, again, please go look for this. And I like maps, beer and whiskey, but that has nothing to do with this talk. If you have any further questions, you can try to reach out on Twitter, but preferably through Mastodon or the Fediverse, because that's what I've been switching to, and I think some other speakers as well here. But let's dive straight into PHP. Now, although the title of the talk is What's New in PHP 8.1 and 8.2, I honestly can't always remember in which PHP versions things have been introduced, so take that with a small approximation. I would say that everything you see in the slides will be available in the latest version of PHP, which is 8.2. But I'd like to go back a little bit further, mostly to see sort of a progression that PHP has been on in the last, well, half decade or 5 years or something like that. Now, I've been writing PHP for a long, long time, and sometimes we had like classes, like a number class, right? I mean, this is a trivial example. They're usually more complicated, such as money or stuff like that, where we want to store a number, and if you want to store that both as an integer or floating point number, you never could, right? The only way how you could do that is by documenting it and hoping your ID tells you if you do things wrong. But of course, this is not great. So PHP started introducing these union types in, I believe, PHP 8.0. So now you can type your properties as well as your arguments and your return types with two different types. Those are the union types, which of course makes it a lot easier. Now, the reason why these were originally introduced into PHP wasn't necessarily so that people using the language could make use of them, but they were introduced sort of as a side effect of changes in PHP itself. With PHP 8.0, we started introducing the JIT engine, a just-in-time compiler to make your PHP code basically run as normal computer-compiled code on your CPUs. Sort of. Not quite, but sort of. And the intention with that was that, well, we get to, if we add more specific types to internal functions, this engine can make use of this information and generate better code that then runs faster again on your systems. But PHP has some interesting internal functions such as microtime, right? And by giving it an argument, it returns a different type. Like if you don't give it any argument or false, then it will return a string, where you have the fraction of seconds, the space, and then the seconds, if you might remember it. Or you give it the Boolean true argument, and then it will turn a returning floating point number. And those are actually sort of union types, but they were never possible to type in the language, where we could only do either string or float. So one of the reasons why we added those union types was then to make sure that we could type this in the language itself, and then the JIT engine could make use of this. Well, that was theory, that never happened, but the side effect is that we now have those union types, and of course, if you can use them in engine-specific code, then it also makes sense to expose this to userland, the language that you use to write PHP code. Now, there's lots of rules around union types. I'm not going to mention all of the things on the slides, but there's always restrictions to what you can do with these union types, and some of these have now been lifted actually. Like void can't be part of a union type. Like it makes no sense for a function to hint that it can return something at the same thing that it can't return something. That makes no sense, right? Pretty much everything that you expect to be logically correct is what union types will allow you to do. With the exception, for example, is that you can't do redundant types. You can't do bool or false. That makes no sense, right? Because if it's a Boolean or false, then it's redundant. False is already included in Boolean. Or you can't do object or whiskey, for example. Or parent class and inherited class. These things make no sense. The order in which you define them also makes no difference whatsoever, and we have this specific case, or we added the specific case that array or traversable is the same as iterable. Now, we've switched that around. If you want to know more about how this type system works, George Peter Banyard gives a talk about it, I don't know when, but later in the conference, where he dives into great detail on how this specific typing works, and also some of the other typing that I'll be showing you a little bit later. Now, we started adding some more strictness to the language in a way that it's easier for you to express how code should behave without having to work around these things, right? I mean, the way how people wrote read-only properties was usually by having a private property. The syntax that I'm using here in construct, if you have not seen that, is like a constructor promoted properties. So if you use like the visibility keyword in the argument list for your constructor, they will actually be turned into private property string name. I have a better slide of that in a moment. And then, yeah, you have the getters to exit information, which means that outside of the class, of course, you can't ever write to name property. But that's a bit of a kludge, and you have to implement getters to get to the data from outside of the class. So PHP 8.1 gets a real keyword, read-only, that enforces that for you. Now, read-only is a little bit tricky because it really should mean write once. Because, of course, at some point, you do need to write a value to the property, right? Otherwise, it's like always going to be null, which is kind of pointless. So the rules for this is can only be initialized once in a constructor preferably, but doesn't have to be the case. Or it can only be initialized from the scope where it was declared, meaning you can't do it outside of the class whatsoever. You can initialize them in factory methods that construct the object that you are then defining this read-only property on, which is kind of nice. You can't have read-only properties on static properties and not on untyped properties. The reason why you can't have them on untyped properties is because the way how the engine works, there's just no way of attaching that kind of information, so it is just not allowed in that case, which I don't think is a real problem, to be honest. Now, of course, sometimes you get classes that only exist out of read-only properties, and in PHP 8.1, you had to specify all of these properties as read-only. From PHP 8.2, you don't have to do that anymore. You can match a whole class as read-only, meaning that all the properties that are defined in it, either through constructor property promotion or defined by hand by yourself, are all defined as read-only now, by default. Now, that does mean that these read-only classes can't have any static properties or untyped properties, because these can't be marked read-only. It also stops it from allowing dynamic properties to be created. Dynamic properties in PHP is basically if you do this and then a property name of a property that hasn't been declared yet, it will just create it on the fly, right? PHP has been doing that for a long, long time. You can't do that with read-only properties. With read-only classes, because then, of course, that property that you then assign a value to is not a read-only property, meaning that you don't have a read-only class anymore. Now, we got some interesting union types introduced. We have mix, which is this whole long list that I won't read out. The introduction of mix is kind of, why would you want to type something that can be everything, right? It's kind of pointless. But that's not really quite true, because it allows you to distinguish between the cases like, I haven't looked at this code yet and all the types where I needed to improve my code to, well, you don't need the types, but it makes it easy to see what's going to happen, or it really accepts any value in this method or return type or property. If you don't define a missing return type, or if you don't define a return type, then the declaration is always going to be mixed or void. I think this is kind of a useful way where you have a specific generic class. Don't talk to me about generics. Maybe later. It's like a generic class where you store things of multiple different things without you having to do anything about it. So mix is kind of useful there. Now, to come back to the constructor property promotion, the reason why we added that is because more and more people started to use things like data value objects. In this case, I have my whiskey class. Yes, I like using emojis in my class names. I would not recommend you do that because it's kind of hard to type, but it's fun. My most annoying trick is to use a non-breaking space in your class name, so it looks like you have a space in your class name. Right. Anyway, again, also don't do that. I'm getting sidetracked here. What constructor property promotion is about is basically, if you have a property defined in your class, if you want to assign them in your constructor, you have to write out the type 2 times, the name of the property 3 times, and yeah, you have to just so much boiler code, right? And so much of my code looked like this, and other people's code, I'm sure as well. This is annoying to have to do. So with constructor property promotion, as I mentioned earlier, you can move the visibility keywords into the constructor parameter declaration, and then you end up with something like this, which is a whole lot easier to do. And also what we added in PHP 8.1 is like the trailer comma here in parameter declarations. It's like this nice little thing that you don't really notice, but it's actually really useful if you want to add more properties to things like these value classes. Now, in my whiskey application that I use to record all my whiskey notes, I have a bunch of things in there that sometimes I want to search for all of the stuff, for all of the notes that I've made, and depending on which situation I am in, I want to include information about the distillery or the description or the notes, or how many items that show up on the page and by which field to sort them, right? And you end up at like sort of a search settings class like this. Now, when I instantiate these things, if I see this in the code, new settings, true, false, when reading that line of code, I have no idea what these true and false keywords actually mean, right? In this case, what I want to do is show everything as normal, but not include the descriptions. But you can't see that from this line of code. Similarly, if I want to just change the sort order, what I have to do is I have to know which position that is in my argument list, and also what the default values of all the other arguments are. It's a very annoying thing to have to do. So what we introduced is named arguments. So named arguments is basically a way of specifying the argument not by position number, but by name. So for example, if I want to not show the descriptions, but everything else keep default, what I can do is just include description : false, and that's it. So I also, from the description for this line of code, I can immediately see what I'm actually intending to do here, as well as not having, in the other case, having to specify all the other default return types, or sorry, default values. Now, I think named arguments for this kind of situations are a good thing to have, but I think you need to be quite careful about where you would use these. Especially because if you can now refer to arguments by name, that also means that the names of these arguments are part of your public API. So if you have a library, for example, and that includes what PHP used to have, sometimes a datetime string was date_string, and sometimes just string, and in other cases was datetime. I mean, it was quite a bit of a mess. And if your API has never been designed to also have your names of your arguments to be consistent or among your own code base, then you're not going to have a good time. What we did for all internal PHP functions, we went through all 3,000 plus of them and made sure all these names were consistent, at least among the same extension. So all the MySQL stuff would have the same names for the same arguments that would mean the same thing. But it also means that if you now publish a library, then users could use argument names by calling methods in your library, for example, but that also means that then you can't change those argument names anymore. And of course, for a library, a public library, you then have to make the decision whether you would consider these argument names part of your API or not. I mean, if you don't, then some of your users interacting with the library might run into problems if they refer to the arguments by name or not. So I think I think the only real use case for named arguments is either among your own code base or when you have things like this, but I would always be very wary of using that by referring to methods of a library that you have no control of, like things you find on packages through Composer, for example. Now, we got some more types. As you have noticed, everything is about more types in PHP. Not only, but many things. And an enumeration is a nice way of describing a data type that can only have a specific set of values. I'm taking a very small example here with currency. In my case, my enumeration can have two values. It can either be GBP for the Great British Pound or EUR for the euro. Other currencies are available. And you can now type against these things. So the definition of enumeration is basically like this. You have enum, type name, internally implemented as a class-ish, sort of. It's complicated. And then you have the two values, which are GBP and EUR, which you specify by using the case keyword. In this example, there are no values associated with anything. It is just the name GBP and EUR are your enumeration values. And the way how you can make use of this is, for example, in your constructor argument in this case, I use private currency, and currency looks like a class name, but it's the class name of an enumeration in this case. And then when you call the constructor with new product here, you specify the enumeration value by using the double colon on currency. So I say currency colon colon EUR to specify the euro. Now what you can, and then you can get a result if you var dump this that looks something like this. So PHP will know what to do with this enumeration and show you a reasonable value here. Now, these enumerations are types, right? So this type can have two values, GBP and EUR, which means that it would also enforce types against that, of course. So what you can't do is then specify as a string EUR, because that is not either currency GBP or currency EUR, and then you'll get your type error because it doesn't fit your type. Hopefully that's what you expect. That's the whole point of having them in the first place, of course. Enumerations can have backed values, either a string or an integer, and those are the only two options at the moment. And you specify that by using colon and then a type name after the enumeration definition. And then each of the cases you can assign either a value to. It has to be either all strings or either all integers. This is called a backed value. In the normal cases, like the slide is the rest is the same. But when you do a var dump, you of course also see the value. But you can of course do useful things with these values. For example, you can access the backed value by using the value property on the enumeration. This isn't something that you have to define yourself. The enumerations are quite a lot of magic things under the hood. They also define some methods I will show you in a moment. But you can access the value. You can also create an enumeration typed value from a backed value. So if you give the string, in this case the pound sign or the euro sign, you will then get the enumeration value back that matches this backed value. What happens if you give it a string, in this case, that isn't matched with a backed value, you'll get an error because you can't do that. Now, which means that if you want to do it from any random source, there is the try from method, static method. So if you give that a backed value that doesn't match any of the values in the enumeration, you'll get null back, otherwise you get the enumeration type back. This is kind of a magic function attached to enumerations. Enumerations, they are classes, so that means you can also have functions defined on them. And in this case, I have the function format. You give it a number, and depending on the currency, it will format the number in either with the currency sign first or last. It's a trivial example. I'm sure you can come up with more useful things than this. But for example, the output is this. If I create the enumeration value currency, GBP, and then I call format 42.75 on it, you get the pound sign and then 42.75 because we're matching here against GBP. Now, match is also a new keyword. It acts like a switch-ish. Instead of having to use case for each of the cases, you basically get a list of statements on the left-hand side, arrow statement on the right-hand side. The one on the right here, the currency GBP, is what you usually would expect to be the value in case. And then the statement on the right is not only the code that is being run, it is what is being returned from match. So what basically those 4 lines say that if we match this, if it's GBP, then we assign this value %.2f to pattern as a return. So at the moment you can only have one statement in there, but that statement could be a function call, of course. What it would also do is that if match finds something that it doesn't have a case for on the left-hand side, you get an error telling you that we found a value that there was nothing matched against. The default keyword still exists, so you can still use that as well, but my slides didn't fit on my slides, to be honest. And then, of course, because the return value assigns to a variable, you can then do something with that variable in a future version, future function call. You can also have static methods. They're mostly useful for as in what you call that in factory methods. So if we give it a locale, it will then return the value, the currency in this case, that belongs to this locale. I have made up locales. UK GB makes no sense because that's Ukrainian in Great Britain. I'm sure some people speak Ukrainian here, but it should be GB_EN really, I believe. I can never remember those locale names. And then, yeah, you can, as I said, you can use those as alternative constructor. There's also a method for listing all the values by using cases, not very interesting. Or you can do this. Sometimes you want to make a list of, in this case, we have constants. We have an array where we have on the left-hand side, we want to have an enumeration value, but on the right-hand side, assign a value with it, right? It's just like an array definition in this case. But you can't do this because on the left-hand side, the constant expression isn't really constant as much, because in arrays, your keys can only really be integers and strings, and an enumeration value is neither an integer or a string, even if they're backed by them. So the way how to get around this is in PHP 8.2, you can access the value property on enumerations in this kind of situation. We originally intended to be able to access any property like this on any class, but we really didn't find a use case for that. There was also a ton of edge cases that were really hard to find out, so at the moment we've restricted this to only properties on enumerations. And the only useful one here is then value, if you want to do that. Some more fun types, we added the never type, which isn't really a type as such, it's more of a declaration that a function never returns. And if your function would end up returning because of a logic failure, then you'd get an error from the PHP engine. So the never keyword is something you define on methods that never return, like if they always throw, for example, or if there's an exit statement in there, or a die, or things like that. It is kind of useful in functions where you set up a redirection, you set a header, and then you want to enforce that no code gets run after this. That's where never comes into play. Similarly, if you have a method that calls another method that you know is never going to return, you can also define that on this kind of implicit methods as well. This keyword was mostly added for like static analysis tools to be able to reason better about how code can act. I have to admit I've never used this in any code myself before, but I don't know yet. We'll find out at some point. Now, things are getting more complicated with types, and I'm going to try this in a sort of way. I mentioned that in PHP 8.0 we introduced union types. But sometimes you need to enforce that a parameter that you pass in is both traversable and countable, if you want to for each over those, for example. And traversable and countable on their own can't do that. So you need to sort of come up with a way of enforcing that there are both interfaces are implemented. And there were hacks around this. Again, please don't use this in production code. The way how this works is that we create two properties, traversable and countable, and are typed with traversable and countable. And then we have a private property both, which would be the name of what that property would be. And what we do in a constructor is that we sign a reference to both traversable and countable. Meaning that whenever you want to set both, because they link to both traversable and countable, you end up having to implement both interfaces, otherwise you can't run this code. Which means that if you try to assign a countable iterator variable that isn't both of them, you'll get a type error on one of these assignments. Now, this is an ugly hack. Please don't ever use this. Instead, use PHP 8.1 where you can actually type these correctly. So these are called pure intersection types. With the word pure actually means here that you can only do intersections. You can't combine them with a union as well. And basically what this means is that the arguments or the properties or the return values needs to implement both interfaces, or mostly both interfaces, I would say. You can only use this for class names and trait names and interface names. You can't use scalar types like a string and int, because nothing can be both a string and an integer at the same time. It's pointless, so we just don't allow you to write code that could never technically work. So these pure intersection types, the only actual use case I've found for that is actually traversable and countable. I'm sure somebody else has other ideas as well. All right, some other cool things that we have. We go back to some other syntax. So in PHP 7.4, what we added is the ... operator that basically includes all the elements of the array that's being referred to into this location. So the return of this would be the fruit salad, that is a pear, a peach, and then a red and a green apples inserted from the first apples array, and then you get a strawberry and a tomato. Although these are all fruits, I don't think having a tomato in a fruit salad is a particularly good idea. But botanists will disagree, I suppose. Now, because we have the main reason why we have this sort of insertion was often when you do things like call user func and stuff like that. But with PHP 8.1, we're getting now named arguments, right? So there had to be a way of introducing a list of named arguments also into other arrays, which is where the support for string keys in these arrays, in the ... operating arrays, now comes into use. So what I have here is I have two arrays. One is apples, one is others, and then we create the array fruits by introducing all the array elements from apples. So that means we end up with having red apple and green apple. And then after that, we're adding all the elements from others with the keys, right? So we have green pear, and because this key is the same name, it would overwrite the original one. And this is really useful if you have, for example, set of option classes where you have a set of defaults and you want to overwrite them with something that's being passed in or defined by a user of your code or of your library or something like that. Which means that in this case, apples would be your set of default values, and then anything and others would basically replace the default values in there. It is sort of the same semantics as I believe you get with the plus operator in between arrays, but then with syntax sugar with the ... operator. I think this is kind of useful, and this is actually something I have used in my libraries because of the case where I had a set of default options and I wanted to override them with something new and different. Now, fibers is something that got introduced in PHP 8.1, and this topic alone, I can't, people can talk an hour and a half about because it's quite a complicated way of doing it. So I don't have the time in this slot to do that. But the idea behind this is that this is sort of cooperative multitasking. There are a way of separating out your code and waiting for I/O at the moment so that it doesn't block your other code from running. That's sort of the easy way of explaining it. What it boils down to is basically that you can have code running in these fibers. Go calls them coroutines, for example. They are a way of separating out chunks of code, and they make a lot of sense if you have to wait for I/O, slow I/O. So it is a way of, what you could do is you could start downloads in 16 different threads, I mean fibers. And then they can pull in data when data comes available on the network instead of having to download the first file first, and then the second file, and then the third file, and things like that. And when one of those fibers is then waiting for I/O, they can say suspend, And then there's then a way of unsuspending those when data becomes available on the socket that they're trying to read from. So this is a way of cooperative multitasking. No code runs at the same time. They all still run in order, but it can then run when other bits of code are waiting for I/O to happen. If any of you are familiar with Windows 3.1, this is how Windows 3.1 implemented multitasking in its operating system. Luckily, we don't live on those times anymore, and we have now, of course, operating systems, including all the versions of Windows and Unix where the operating system interrupts the tasks. But that is not what fibers are or what Windows 3.11 is. There's no logic that interrupts fibers, or in Windows 3.1 case, programs at any random interval. That is not how this works. I don't know whether there's a talk about fibers available on this conference. If you're interested in, I'm sure there's quite a few recorded and findable on the internet. To get back to some of the slightly more boring syntax additions to PHP, sometimes we add things because they're necessary for functionality, and sometimes we add things to make it look better. And in this case, both. Now, you might be aware of that in PHP you can refer to a method or a function by specifying an array with the object variable in it and the method name. These are also the callable type. Now the callable type is kind of useful, but not in this kind of situations. See, I have this test class, right? And I want to get a reference to a private method from that I then can call later by just using this reference. Now before PHP 8.1, I would say the only way how you could do it is by doing as two array elements this and private method. But what would happen if you tried to call this, you'd actually get an error, because the moment where this is called, this is now no longer the same object, and the scope wouldn't allow you to call a private method, right? Calling private method here is basically just a shortcut for calling this private method. And you can't call that because it's a private method. So what we introduce first is closure from callable. It's a way of, at that moment, binding this already to the closure that is being returned. And because the scope is then bound, you can then call the method, because the private method is called in the scope of the closure, which is bound to this. So that would be okay, and you could call the private method. But having to type closure : from callable and then your object's variable and then your method name is cumbersome. So what we introduce is another version of the ... operator as the sole thing in between the parentheses that you call to any method or function. This basically does exactly the same thing as closure from callable, but in a nicer way. And you can do this on basically anything that you would expect it to do. So it isn't actually new functionality. It is functionality that just makes it easier to use already existing functionality. Something we call syntactic sugar. It makes it nice and sweet and sparkly, I suppose. You can do this for everything. I mean, there's more versions, but I didn't fit on the slide, to refer to any method as this. The intention at some point is to extend this to not only requiring a reference to a function, but also already to fill in some default values. These are called, well, I've heard different names, but partial applicable functions is one of those terms I've been hearing about, which is basically a nice way of being able to chain these kind of references to methods with information all pre-filled in. It is something that functional programming uses a lot, and we have some fans of functional style programming in the PHP developer community, and so we might see some more work on that in the future. Whether that comes in PHP 8.3 or not, we'll have to see. Probably not, actually. Now, PHP 8.2 also introduced some new types. So the null and false types that we added in PHP 8.0 to be part of unions weren't allowed to be used standalone. So you couldn't type a return type as just false. It had to be string or false. And similarly, null or false, you couldn't do either. You had to use null or bool and things like that. You also couldn't use null standalone, which means that if you had a class like this, you have like a user finder that returns either a user if it finds one by email address, or null if it doesn't find anything. If you wanted to have like a test class or a null implementation of this user finder for using somewhere, you couldn't actually type in that with null, even though that logically should have been allowed. But PHP 8.2 now allows that, so you can type things against null and false, which is kind of useful. We also didn't have a true type. We only had false and null, but not true. So we decided to make the language a little bit more consistent and also now allow true in the same situation where you have false. Now, it doesn't necessarily, of course, make a lot of sense to type arguments to functions or return types as true or false, because a method that always returns the same thing is usually kind of pointless. Because why would you return anything or accept any argument in the first place? But sometimes when you're refactoring code, you figure out that, take for example the microtime function in PHP. If in PHP 9, for example, we would only allow it being returned as a floating point number, which means we can only accept true as arguments, we could change the type hint from bool, what it currently is, to true, so then enforce it when you call microtime, to make sure that you always get the same floating point return type back. Of course, that is a backward breaking change, and we are not considering doing that for microtime, but that would be a situation where it would make sense to type in against the values false and true. One other thing I have to say about false and true: if you are writing code where you don't have strict types enabled in your file, then if you would define a type as bool, then PHP would coerce any data into bool, so either turning it into true or false. But if you type it against false or true, and the value that you're passing in isn't false or true, you'll get a type error. It doesn't then coerce to false or true, because again, that makes little sense to do. All right, so in PHP 8.0 we got union types, right? Int or float. In PHP 8.1 we got the intersection types, where you have, or pure intersection type, where you have the end. Both of these things have to be true at the same time. And in PHP 8.2 we introduced DNF types, or disjunctive normal form types. You can guess why we call them DNF types, because it's a lot easier to pronounce. Which basically allows you to define types as a union of intersections. It doesn't allow you to do a intersection of unions. There's also no need for that, because it can always be rewritten. Again, if you're interested in how all this stuff works, George has a much more in-depth talk on that later in the conference. The only use case that I've seen people use it for so far is to create a union between array or traversable and countable. Again, for each cases in some case. So you can then accept both an object that implements traversable and countable, or an array, because in an array you can also for each over, of course. Yes, although my syntax doesn't quite look the same, because array isn't an intersection of two different types, it's an intersection of just itself, but that's still an intersection. So you can do single type, or intersection, or set of intersections. Again, I haven't seen all the use cases for it yet, but I'm sure they exist. We also get a new random extension, which is my favorite slide, because every time I reload it, it shows something else. It's a nice way, a nice API to create random data in a mostly safe way. Now, of course, it isn't true random, it's still a pseudo-random engine, but multiple engines are implemented. Some of them are a bit slower, some of them are default, some of them have ridiculously complicated names, so I will not try to pronounce the first line of this code. Most of them you can give a seed value, which is useful if you want to reproduce the same random values. I mean, that might sound weird, but there's use cases for doing that. You do that by specifying in this case, a integer. I've commented it out. Otherwise, if I refresh the slide, I'd always get the same results. On this randomizer object, you can then things called get bytes to just get a random section of bytes. In this case, I want 8 bytes. if I would show them directly, it would gargle up my screen. So I'm converting them from binary numbers to hexadecimal. Similarly, you can get an integer in a specific range, or just get the next integer out of the randomizer engine. But also things that are kind of useful are picking a set of keys out of an array. There's been several cases where I would have found that useful. I mean, you can sort of emulate it by using array shuffle and array, I think it was called array swap. It's the one that swaps values and keys and stuff like that. So it is implementable, but it was never done in a nice way. And it also wasn't as correctly random as this random extension does it. So you can do pick arrays, and then you get 2 arrays keys out of it. Similarly, I have to make the slide once smaller. You can also do shuffle array, which shuffles the array in a determinate but random way, whereas array shuffle in PHP, again, was a bit shaky. And also it allows you to do shuffle bytes, which is useful if you have a string that you want to scramble. As you can see the bottom of my screen, it changes to different fruit salads, and different order of the letters in PHP is great. I think it is kind of useful to have this kind of APIs in PHP because they are a great way of making sure that you do things correctly. Just like we introduced a password set of functions, like the password hash functions. These are always a set and good way of doing this, and much better than trying to come with your own randomization or random ways of creating a set of things out of an array, for example. So please use these if you can, instead of hand-rolling things. Now, you might remember that I mentioned dynamic properties when I was talking about read-only classes, where you couldn't have, where a read-only class, you can't create new properties that haven't been declared yet. We actually started deprecating these altogether in PHP. So PHP 8.2 now throws a deprecation notice if you try to write to a property that you haven't defined yet. I was the only one that voted against that. I now disagree with that, by the way. Yeah, I know, I'm disagreeing with myself. Because funnily enough, I was later upgrading some code to run it on PHP 8.2, and my tests started throwing deprecation warnings because one of my fellow library authors had spelled palette differently twice. I mean, they're both English words, but they mean something very different, right? So this was showing in my test the following deprecation warning. It says the creation of dynamic property palette is deprecated because we declared it as palette instead of palette. Of course, I had to now fix this code. So I actually found this useful because in the cases where you have it protected, it makes not so much sense, maybe. But if you have a typed property that you then misspell, then it doesn't enforce the types anymore, right? So I think this is now useful. And if I could change my vote, I would. But also, it wasn't important enough to do that. So I had to make a quick patch to my code. I have since then had to create many more of these in other bits of code. Now, of course, there are some situations where these dynamic properties actually do make sense. Hydration from a database table, for example. And there are 2 ways around the deprecation warning. You can either make your class extend from std class. So std class, of course, is a object in PHP that you can't declare types properties on at all because it's implemented in the engine. So you can still always use std class and define dynamic properties of that. Or there is a attribute that you can set on a class, which is called allow dynamic properties, and then you also won't get the deprecation warning. Now, at the moment, this is a deprecation warning that is basically a way of telling the users of the PHP language that this is functionality that is going to go away in the future. We don't remove these things until the next major version of PHP, which would be 9. When PHP 9 comes out, we don't know yet. I mean, it's very likely that the next version is going to be PHP 8.3. We only really bump the major versions if we actually end up breaking things or introducing a new big shiny thing, such as a JIT engine or a vastly improved engine that we did in PHP 7. So deprecations are a way of the PHP developers telling you, you're going to have to look and pay attention to this, because it's going to go away in the future. It doesn't necessarily mean that the moment you see the deprecation warning, your library is broken that you're using, and it's also not a reason of pushing or suggesting to library maintainers that they need to go fix their code, because it isn't technically broken. Unfortunately, lots of people in either their error handlers upskill even deprecation warnings to exceptions and errors, but that is not the right way of dealing with these deprecation warnings, because it's just a hint to developers that something is going to change. PHP unit also used to do this. It would consider deprecation the same as a notice, a warning, and promote those to exceptions and failure tests. PHP unit does not do that anymore and hasn't done for quite some time, because, as I said, deprecations isn't something about stuff that is wrong now, but it's something that is going to go away in PHP in the future. All right, and the last thing I want to show you is sensitive parameters. This was proposed by a person that works for a company that has a bit of software that their customers install on their own machines. Don't exactly remember what sort of product it was, but administrators of the software run by these third-party clients of them, they had a forum and they would share problems in there, and sometimes they would share stack dumps. But these stack dumps often included their AWS keys or their usernames and passwords to the databases. And of course, that isn't something you want to share with the rest of the world. So he came up with this idea of, well, maybe it might be nice to specify that specific arguments are sensitive. And if you add this sensitive parameter attribute to these arguments, then they will not show up in stack traces. So that's what happens now. So in this case, because we have marked password as a sensitive parameter, if you get a stack trace for whatever reason, in this case I'm just throwing an exception, then in the stack trace, you will see that it's been converted to an object of sensitive parameter value, and it doesn't show you the value. If you use getDebug backtrace, the value would also be replaced by an object of sensitive parameter value without you being able to see the value directly. However, you can still access the value by, I believe, the value property, or the getValue method, one of them. So this is a way of preventing these things when they get converted to strings from showing up in screens or log files. That's the intention here. Now, if you have xdebug loaded, it doesn't actually convert it to a object, because it doesn't have to, because xdebug would only create strings out of it. It doesn't have this getDebug backtrace functionality, because that's part of PHP. So I do it in a slightly simpler way in xdebug by showing the value as the string sensitive parameter, because I don't need to do more than that. Now, that does not mean that if you're debugging this in a debugger, that your values get replaced by sensitive parameter. It's only something that happens if you're converting anything to a string, like in a stack trace, like I'm doing here. I think this is kind of neat to have. So not only can you use this parameter, this attribute for code that you write yourself, it is also, we have gone through the PHP source code, and every time when we have either a username or a hash value or a password possibility, we've also internally added this sensitive parameter attribute. So anything for internal functions like MySQL Connect and things like that will also only show up as sensitive parameter in your stack traces, which I think is a nice, safe way of doing things. All right, that's about what I had to talk to you about PHP 8.1 and 8.2. About 8.3, I can't say very much because not very many things have been accepted. I reckon that will change in another month or two once we get closer and closer to feature freeze in July somewhere. So yeah, hopefully this was useful. I certainly didn't cover all the changes in 8.1 and 8.2 because there are so many more in these. If you have any questions, I am happy to spend some time answering them. Otherwise, thank you very much.
So I neglected to mention at the start, those of you who have joined on Discord, feel free to ask questions in the channel. There's a Portaton channel if you prefer not to be handed a microphone. I think it's important everyone has a voice. Are there any questions for Derick at all?
There are questions. But
So I will run over with a
Can
microphone.
we change something with the light so I can see the audience? That'd be nice. Magic will happen, hopefully.
Hi, Derick.
Hi.
Regarding the randomizer, you mentioned one
Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
Regarding the randomizer, you mentioned one randomizer engine there.
Yeah.
How many are there, and is there a cryptographically secure one?
I think there are 3 at the moment. There's your standard Mercent twister, the one I showed, and there's another one that I can't remember what it is now. The reason why there's different engines is that other languages implement also these engines. So if you want to match random numbers with the same in different languages, you can then generate the same values, which is useful if you, I can imagine it'd be useful if you're doing things like two-factor authentication where you have a seed number on each side and you have to generate the same random numbers in different languages. So that's why these engines make sense that there are different implementations of them. All right. Anything else?
Any other questions?
No questions? That works for me.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is your favorite feature and why?
My favorite feature? Oh, yeah, I don't know. I think it's more of a progression of things, like the progression of being able to add more types, being more expressive with what you write in your code, but having to result to hex or documentation. Because of course, adding these types to things isn't only useful for you, it's also useful for all the tools that you're using, because they can also use that to infer things and suggest on how to make your code better. Both IDEs do that, as well as the static analysis tools like Psalm and PHP Stand, for example. So I think it's more the progression than specific features in the language.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The slides will be up there later as well.
There we go.
And I'll pop into Discord later as well. I haven't done so yet. But oh, there's another one there. Sorry. It's hard for me to see anything. I just blank wall here.
Do you think we'll get something like structural type aliases or type defs in C terminology?
That's a good question. Because our types are getting more complicated now, we sometimes here say, well, I don't like to have to type array or traversable and countable all the time. And a common way for doing that is creating type aliases so that you don't have to do that again. So yeah, this is something that we're looking at doing, but it is kind of making the type aliases themselves isn't the hard bit. The hard bit is where do you define them and how do you scope them. So in PHP, every class tends to end up in the same file. And because these types are sort of classes, one of the logical conclusions could be that, well, these type definitions, because they're own classes, they have to be in their own file, which means they would be able to use just and auto-load it on the fly, for example. But that's kind of annoying to have lots of files that only have the type definitions in there, right? The other alternative is that we set these type definitions in just the files where they are being declared in, because that's how PHP usually works. Every single file is seen as its own unit, and it doesn't share anything with other files. That's, I think, quite a good way of design of the language itself is. But that means that if you have a type alias, you'd have to copy the type alias to every file or every class where you then make use of the type alias. Because of these things, we haven't quite come up with either solution or a better solution in that yet. So that's why we don't have them yet. But it is on our list to want to add to the language. Maybe PHP 8.3. We'll see. Yep.
Any other questions? Any of you have just joined Discord? I've just approved you if you wanted to ask. Because there was a flood of 5 that just joined, so... Okay, another one
All right.
on the microphone.
I didn't see that, but...
Yes, we do have 4 minutes to fill for any other questions. It's always good to get questions.
Oh.
Is there any performance benefits of using, actually that question I wanted to ask about read-only, but if there's anything else that you think that could contribute to performance, which one would you recommend, or is there any?
Well, everything that you additionally use in a language will hit performance a little bit. I would be very surprised if you could notice that. because with any property that has read-only on it, it already has to be a type property. So the performance hit comes from the type checking, not from the read-only checking. Because that's just a single comparison saying, has this property been written to yes or no? And doing a if check on a single bit is pretty quick. So no, I don't think you can notice it. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm pretty sure you can notice it. Yeah. Yeah, one here. All the way in the front.
I was just wondering if there's been any discussion, because of a lot of the recent type changes, about improvements to the reflection type API. Because having used the reflection type specifically, it's really not developer friendly at the moment. But I haven't seen any proposals. Have you heard of anything?
So, yeah, I will.
Okay, I'll do it with the
I will summarize
microphone
it too.
closer.
So,
are there any improvements to the reflection type APIs? Because with a lot of the recent type changes, it's got quite confusing.
yes, it's gotten more confusing with the reflection with all the different complicated types, because we need to make sure that we also don't break people making use of the reflection classes. But because we get now nested types and things, it gets really complicated to use. It broke all of your code, I'm sorry. That is, of course, never our intention. But yeah, they are complicated, and we're trying not to change the return if we don't need to. Coming up with a better API for it at some point makes sense, but by redoing an API, you'll definitely end up breaking lots of people's code. So I don't think we'll see that in any PHP 8 version, but redoing reflection for types for PHP 9 is something I can definitely see showing up on the roadmap.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is always that trade-off, isn't there? Do you improve the API but risk breaking code everywhere, or leave things as they are, but then you don't have that feature and you have to wait much longer for a major release? But okay, I think
20 seconds.
I think that is, yeah, I think we have time. If there's a quick question at all, I think that is good. We are done. Okay. Thank you, Derick. Let's get another hand for Derick. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.